So, how's the weather by you guys? What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Lombardi Time Brews. I am your host, John Del Rey. Yes, we are still on Rodgers watch. Yes, as of me recording this Friday afternoon, we still don't know what is going to happen with Aaron Rodgers. Ian Rappaport is basically giving hourly updates on NFL Network at this point, and all anyone is really saying at this juncture is, yeah, we don't know. Aaron Rodgers is still taking his time to decide. Everyone seems in agreement that by far the least likely option is him coming back to the Packers. So at this juncture, it's either, does Aaron Rodgers want to retire, which I do think is still a real possibility, I really do, or does Aaron Rodgers give the go-ahead for both teams to finalize the trade that has been talked about now, finish out those last details, whatever it is that needs to be done, and make the trade happen, and let's move on with this. There's also the possibility, I'm just going to throw it out there, of another team entering conversations too. It's possible, right? There was reports coming out of Vegas today that while it's a long shot, the Raiders could be in on someone like Aaron Rodgers or Lamar Jackson. It's just the money is prohibitive. So it's possible, right? But as of this moment, we know it probably more than likely is between either Aaron Rodgers just retiring and leaving all that money on the table, or giving the go-ahead, being traded to the Jets. These are our most likely options. In yesterday's video, I covered what I believe to be fair Aaron Rodgers compensation. The end that I think is too high, the end that I think is too low, and what realistically is that middle ground. So today, I decided I would cover something a little different, because there has been a ton of discussion in all the different mediums about Brian Gutekunst. Is he going to wind up getting fleeced on this deal? Is Aaron Rodgers going to be dealt for only a 7th round pick? Well, of course not. But I decided let's dive in here because there is a lot of apprehension. There's a lot of anxiousness. Brian Gutekunst does have an extensive history of general manager of the Packers now of making trades. So let's look at those trades and see how he did. Has there ever been a time that he has absolutely been taken to the cleaners? Has there been a time where he has swindled a fellow GM? Let's dive into his history today and find out. Before I get to that though, big welcome to all of the new subscribers who joined after yesterday's video. Very, very glad to have you here. Very, very thankful that you're here. Glad you're here at Lombardi Time Brews. Also, 2 quick notes that before the topic of the day. These are news items that just happened a little bit ago. David Bakhtiari's contract restructure is now complete. Yes, there was, as the Packers were getting closer and closer to the deadline to restructure this contract, there was a lot of thinking of like, they haven't done it yet. Maybe he's going to be included with Rodgers. In all likelihood, you can rule out that talk now. It was a simple restructure, nets the Packers about $7.5 million in cap space right now. Because they didn't do a max restructure with void years, it does leave about $4.5 million on the table. Also, this could spell this being David Bakhtiari's last year in Green Bay. But per the norm, we can rule out him being traded into a deal with the Jets, because generally if a restructure was going to occur, the Jets would be doing the restructuring with the trade, not the Packers restructuring now in order to do the trade. It just isn't how these things typically are done. So David Bakhtiari's restructure is done. Second, the Packers finalized their coaching list. Rich Bisaccia getting a very nice promotion now, being promoted. He is still the special teams coordinator, but now he's got an additional little title on there, and it happens to be assistant head coach. I love this for the Packers. I love Bisaccia's attitude. I think he is the perfect person for that role to bring more attitude to the head coaching circle of offices. Also, important there as well, Tom Clements, quarterback coach, is sticking around. Yes, he came out of retirement last year to do the last ride with Rodgers, or just because he, wanted to keep coaching. We never got full clarity on that, but we do know that he is one of the best in the business, and him sticking around, regardless of who the quarterback is a huge win for the Packers. Could it change if Rodgers gets traded? He could just retire? Yeah, of course. But Tom Clements being the quarterback coach, it's a win for the Packers if he stays. All right, let's dive into the topic. Now, Brian Gutekunst has done a ton of different trades in his time as GM since taking over in 2018. And a lot of them are like, here, I'm going to give you my 6th for your 2 7ths. And like trades of very, very little consequence. And so I didn't want to go through all of those. That's just exhausting and too much. And frankly, kind of tough to get fleeced on that when you're just dealing with the numbers of picks. Okay, so I limited this to either player for pick trades like Davante Adams last year, or what I defined as high leverage trades, meaning trades involving top 100 draft picks. The other rule that I have as we go through this is if we're talking draft picks, I'm talking about the value of the draft picks. Predominantly, I use Jimmy Johnson's trade value chart that assigns points to picks. I did reference over the caps methodology in here a little bit too, but ultimately at the end of the day, what we're worrying about is the trades that are made on draft day. I'm not necessarily concerning myself with who was drafted with said picks. Because right now we're just looking at the trade history of Gutekunst. Is he good at trading? Is he bad at trading? If you want to know the player who was picked with the pick, that's drafting. And I think that that's a different component of the general manager job. What I'm really trying to assess is he good at trading? So I left a lot of the names out of it just so we could see, did he numerically win a lot of these or not? So let's dive in. Trade number 1 is one of the larger trades of the last 20 years for the Green Bay Packers. It occurred last year, yes, the Davante Adams trade. So a quick recap of that trade. Basically, the Packers traded Davante Adams, and in return, the Las Vegas Raiders sent to the Packers picks 22 and 53. Now, a little bit of context here. We know that Davante Adams, after playing in Green Bay for years, was franchise tagged because the Packers and Davante couldn't work out a long-term contract. He also said that he wasn't going to play under the tag. So they were kind of at a rock and a hard spot, right? So the Green Bay Packers had to do something. Davante had made it very much known that he wanted to go to the Raiders so he could go play with Derek Carr, go back home. Of course, in hindsight, we've seen how that's worked out for him. But nonetheless, the Packers were kind of backs up against the wall. They had this tremendous asset, this great player, but he wasn't going to play for him anymore. And he had a very specific place that he wanted to go. Sounding kind of vaguely-ish familiar? But anyway, the Raiders sent over a first and a second round pick in the form of 22 and 53. And the initial thinking at the time was that the Packers didn't do well enough on this trade for an all-world wide receiver. But I beg of you to consider the context, okay? Because there's a comp that happened very, very close by, and that happened to be the Chiefs and the Dolphins trading Tyreek Hill. In that trade, the Chiefs traded Tyreek Hill to the Dolphins and in return got picks 29, 50, a 4th rounder, and then 2023, 4 and 6. Okay. Now, Tyreek Hill was in a similar situation. The Chiefs had approached him about a long-term extension. Talks were not going well, and it was clear that it was time for him to go. But at the same time, there were multiple teams bidding for Tyreek Hill. And from the outset, you're going to hear about that and think, well, the Dolphins paid more than the Raiders did. I mean, they paid a 1, a 2, a 4, and then a 4 and a 6. And the Packers only got the 1 and 2. But when you look at where those picks were, and you compared it to a trade value chart, the Packers actually did pretty well. In fact, per most metrics, it's a wash. Now, if you're looking at, for instance, the newest, I think the Hill methodology of calculating these, because of the draft picks this year, the Chiefs do edge up a little bit. But if you're looking at the Jimmy Johnson system or several of the others, this kind of winds up being a wash, especially when you take into account the discount that comes with picks being a year later. So ultimately, at the end of the day, and this particular trade, on this one, the Packers are at a severe disadvantage. Davante Adams was not going to play for them anymore, and you can argue about whether that was the right call, whether Davante was selfish, whether Gutekunst screwed that up. Doesn't matter. You can argue about all of that, but at the end of the day, Davante Adams wasn't going to play for the Packers anymore, and he had one team in particular in mind that he was going to play for. And the Packers basically said, okay, we'll work out a trade with them. And still got a 1 and a 2, which is kind of market rate when comparing it to the Tyreek Hill trade. It's a good deal. Also keep in mind that Davante Adams was on a franchise tag. He was on a 1-year deal, so he had to go sign an extension with the Raiders as well. The other thing that seems to be forgotten a lot in this conversation is it has been verified several times that if we're going to assign blame to the Packers, just keep in mind that they did offer Davante Adams the same contract that the Raiders offered, then even went over, and Davante still wanted to go play for Vegas. Whether you find fault in that reasoning or not, whatever, but these are the facts as they occurred. Let's look at trade number 2, also happening last year. Now, this one was a pure draft pick trade, but Goody made the rare decision to trade with an in-division rival, trading with the Minnesota Vikings. He traded picks 53 and 59 for the Vikings pick 34. Now, we know that 34 pick was eventually used to pick Christian Watson. But if you look at the value chart, this is one of the only trades throughout the whole history I'm going to go through that you can say Brian Gutekunst got fleeced. Yeah, he got taken advantage of by the Vikings. But why did it happen? Let's look at the context. And realistically, Brian Gutekunst had missed out on the last 3 years' worth of first-round receivers. Because we know at different times he had tried to go get receivers that he had fallen in love with, and it just never happened. Prices were too great. He wasn't willing to pull the trigger, whatever it may be. So here, he made what you could call a desperation move to get up and get Christian Watson. But let's acknowledge the truth that, yes, per any point chart, the Packers did lose this trade tremendously. This one goes in the loss column, no matter what got picked. I know you may not be upset about having Christian Watson, but just from a numerical standpoint, this was a loss and an overpay for Brian Gutekunst. Moving on to the next trade, there was a draft day trade with the Titans. This was a couple of years ago. The Packers traded picks 92 and 135. The Titans traded back pick 85. So in terms of points on the Jimmy Johnson metric, it was 165 versus 171. It's a wash. It's a wash. It is what it is. Just a pure asset trade there. Next, I'm going to talk about one of the most, divisive moments in Packer history. The choosing of Jordan Love. Now, again, we're just looking at the picks. Just the picks themselves. And you can feel about Jordan Love and the pick as it was done however you want to feel. The truth is, both sides do make a lot of sense here. If you're upset because the Green Bay Packers could have used a first-round pick on an asset to actually help the team after they were so successful in 2019, I get it. Or if you believe that the Packers were right because while Aaron Rodgers just had a very strong 2019, he wasn't exactly MVP form yet, and Father Time's ticking and Rodgers at the time was beginning to at least kind of sort of ish mention retirement, well, okay, you can see that too. There are two sides to the story, right? So let's just look at the transaction as it occurred. The Green Bay Packers traded picks 30 and 136 for the Dolphins pick 26. In terms of points on the Jimmy Johnson draft chart, the Packers acquired 700 points. The Dolphins acquired 658. May not sound that different, but is the difference of a day 3 pick. The Packers ultimately, in terms of value, won that trade. So how you feel about it, completely up to you. But in terms of just looking at the value of the picks, it's at least close, but it tilts out in the Packer favor. Now let's look at the Darnell Savage trade years ago. The Packers traded picks 30, 114, 118 to the Seahawks for pick 21. Another pretty easy trade, just pure number point values assigned on these. The Packers ultimately acquired 820 points. The Seahawks acquired 744. Packers then went on to use pick 21 to Darnell Savage. But another imbalanced trade toward the Packers. Okay, so let's go another year back. Now, this would have been Brian Gutekunst's first rodeo. But let's take a look at this. The Green Bay Packers traded Demarius Randall, picks 114 and 150, to the Cleveland Browns for quarterback DeShone Kizer, pick 101 and pick 138. Now, it's very hard to quantify this numerically, right? Because you've also got players involved, but basically what happened is Brian Gutekunst traded a very, very disgruntled, non-schematic fitting Demarius Randall and traded him away, along with a couple picks, slightly upgraded those two picks, and got a backup quarterback in the form of DeShone Kizer, who we came to learn afterwards Gutekunst loved Kizer and was kind of sort of hoping he would grow into something more than just being a backup anyway. Now, why does this one go down ultimately as a loss for the Packers? Look, Randall, it's not like he went and let the NFL on fire after he left. And Gutekunst did wind up upgrading both of these picks in this trade. But DeShone Kizer. This was an assessment failure on the part of the Packers to believe that DeShone Kizer would go forward and have a fruitful NFL career with the Green Bay Packers. And to be fruitful, it's not like he had to take over for Rodgers and be the heir apparent, right? Like, he just had to be a capable backup at that time. And Kizer proved eventually to be incapable of that. So, this is a failure. But it's a personnel failure. It's a failure to identify what Kizer was in the league. And now, for one of the best and weirdest interactions we ever had from a general manager of the Green Bay Packers, a draft day trade. In Brian Gutekunst's first draft, the Green Bay Packers traded with the New Orleans Saints, and they sent pick 14 to the Saints, and in return got 27, 147, and 2019. A first rounder in 2019, I should say. Okay, but then, trade 2. What happened was they then traded pick 27, along with their own pick 76 and 186, to the Seahawks for 18 and 248. So at the end of the day, between these two trades that were orchestrated one right after the other, he traded back in the first round 4 spots and a third rounder to essentially net a first rounder in the next year. That's like the movie Draft Day kind of trading. Like, that is quality next level. And I remember when that all happened and they traded way back in the first and everyone was like, what is he doing? And then that worked out because they traded back up and then they got Jay Alexander. Sorry, excuse me. But it all worked out. And what really made it was the fact that there was the first trade and the second one. If it was just the first trade, we may historically talk about this a bit different. And there's one final trade that I want to bring your attention to. In the summer of ill content of Aaron Rodgers, when the Packers truly had to coax him back. I'm talking, this was the year where there was the draft day breaking news from Schefter and everyone else that Rodgers is never, ever, ever coming back to Green Bay again, and Green Bay has to repair the relationship and all these things. One of the things that eventually came clear that summer was that Randall Cobb needed to come back home to Green Bay. That Aaron Rodgers' happiness was partially being balanced on the scales of whether Randall Cobb would come back or not. So Brian Gutekunst had to make this trade. He had to get Cobb back, whether he wanted to do it or not. So he called up the Texans. And realistically, Packers had to give something. So they gave a 7th rounder. Now, people in the NFL knew at the time how important it was that Cobb gets back to the Packers. Trey Wingo, of all people, tweeted about it. And yet, all we had to pay was a 7th rounder in order to do it. The Texans could have held Cobb ransom and demanded a 7th that conditionally becomes something else. You know, if Randall Cobb goes and plays 2 years for you, it becomes a 5th, whatever, right? And the Houston Texans, as a rebuilding team, were in a position to potentially do something like that. Push the pick out, but make it better, who cares? And nonetheless, it just was a pure 7th that Gutekunst had to trade for him. And I guess I bring that up to illustrate a larger point. Has every single trade that Brian Gutekunst done been an ultimate, absolute win? No. Realistically, he overpaid in the Christian Watson trade and completely failed to assess DeShone Kizer. But have there been some momentous wins for Brian Gutekunst as well? Yeah. Yeah, I would argue the Jair Alexander set of transactions was masterful. And there's also been a bevy of trades that have just worked out in terms of, you know, the numerical balancing of whether things are even between the teams. Sure, most of the time they've been slanted to the Packers, but in a very small way. So a lot of the trades have been a wash. But the thing that I would point to, and is quite pertinent right now, And granted, we don't know what's going to happen with Aaron Rodgers. We don't know what those negotiations look like. Maybe it is like some of the people in my comments last night saying, oh, it's going to be a 4th and a 6th and whatever for Rodgers. But we know that Brian Gutekunst has a track record of doing some of his best negotiating when options are limited. He got a market value deal for Davante Adams for all intents and purposes. That was some very difficult negotiation. Only had to pay a 7th for Randall Cobb, and the entire league knew that Gutekunst needed to get Randall Cobb. So I'm saying is, we don't know how this is going to go. And you could feel about Brian Gutekunst however you feel. Maybe you think he's terrible at his job. Maybe he doesn't sign enough free agents. Maybe he's bad at drafting. Okay. But I'm looking at his trade history here. And per both numerical balances and returns per what's comparable on the market, he at least always gets market deals. The exception of a couple transactions. So, at the end of the day, we're just going to see how this bears out. And it can happen any time now, Aaron. So, thanks for coming with me on Lombardi Time Brews. Like I've been saying the past couple of days, I don't know when I'm going to be back. I don't know. No one knows anything at this point. So, maybe you'll see me later tonight if news breaks. Maybe it'll be a 3 a.m. emergency video. Maybe it'll be sometime this weekend. Maybe you won't even see me till Monday. Who knows at this point? But I think we could all use a conclusion to this story awfully soon. Thanks so much for joining me on Lombardi Time Brews. I hope you're having a great day. If I don't see you again, have an absolutely great weekend. Welcome to the new subs. And as always, go Pack Go.